U.S. protests over the death of George Floyd at the hands of police officers show no signs of stopping. What kind of turning point in policing and politics is the U.S. facing? And why are some U.S. politicians trying to drag China into it? And some foreign airlines will be allowed to fly into China for the first time in months. What's the story behind the change? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Largely peaceful marches continued Thursday in dozens of cities across the U.S. As the violence calmed down, some cities are lifting their curfews. But in Washington, D.C., new fencing has been installed to bolster security at the White House. Meanwhile, prosecutors have charged all 4 officers involved in George Floyd's death, and the charges against the one who had his knee on Floyd were expanded Wednesday to second-degree murder. Somehow, China got mentioned in the mix of it. Why? I'm joined in Beijing by Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, via Skype. Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, a consultancy firm based in Beijing. And on the phone in Philadelphia, we have Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategies, a communications consulting company. Warm welcome to all of you. I want to start with China, of course. Let's take a look at this tweet from U.S. Senator from Florida, Marco Rubio. He said last Sunday that he saw very heavy social media activity on protests and counter reactions from social media accounts linked to at least 3 foreign adversaries. They didn't create these divisions, but they are actively stoking and promoting violence and confrontation from multiple angles. Meanwhile, media headlines have also linked China to the incident by saying China takes a victory lap over U.S. protests, and China, Russia and Iran using state media to attack U.S. over George Floyd killing. So, John, let me go to you. Are these accurately capturing the sentiment among the Chinese people, or even, about what the state media are doing in China? Let's not talk about Iran and Russia. And what is your perception of how the Chinese people in general are feeling about what happens around Floyd's death?
Well, Senator Marco Rubio mentioned 3 countries, and he calls them 3 adversaries. I'm not even sure that China is one of them, actually. And I don't think that it's surprising at all that people in China would comment on this, and people would make comments on social media talking about this. But this has nothing to do, with interfering in the United States domestic policies. If you compare to what Marco Rubio did himself with respect to the turmoil in Hong Kong last year, he went over into Hong Kong and he made a statement: there's absolutely no violence. That's what he said. And you compare that act with what he said now, it's, in my opinion, that's total hypocrisy. What he said is doesn't make sense at all to me.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that he's appears to try in other countries instead of finding the real reason of this, this cancerous problem in the United States, is just deplorable.
What he actually said when he visited Hong Kong, he said he hasn't seen signs of violence. He hasn't heard about any violence. So we don't know whether he watched TV at all. We don't know why he said those things. But when it comes to China, John, however, we have seen a lot of Chinese people commenting on this. This has to be acknowledged. There are a lot of articles circulating, for instance, on the social media about what happened in the United States. But are they, first of all, trying to stoke or promote violence, or China takes a victory lap, whether it is the Chinese government or the Chinese people? John, what do you say?
No, how can they? I mean, a lot of people here in China don't even write in English, let alone
No, in
writing...
Chinese, of course. In Chinese.
Well,
what are they writing in Chinese about?
Right. So when they write in Chinese, how can it be possible to stoke division in the United States? People in the United States don't read Mandarin Chinese, right? So, you know,
well, what about those who can speak English and who have access to the international social media, for instance? What are they writing? Are they trying to stoke violence? I mean, you know, I'm just trying to get your perception, and is there any evidence about what Marco Rubio says?
Well, I think what people are expressing, people here in China expressing is just shock at what happened in Minnesota. And also they are shocked at the extent of you know, the demonstration sweeping across the United States and how the White House has responded to this. There's a couple of events, for example, you know, cleaning the Lafayette Square and just for this photo opportunity at this church. It's just deplorable to me. But to be honest with you, I'm a little bit skeptical that people here in China understand the extent and inherent nature of racial discrimination that has been going on for decades and decades in the United States.
I think this time they have a better idea. But we're really talking about, you know, how the Chinese people's reaction is being represented in the U.S. In the mouth of some people, some politicians in the United States, and it's not just coming from the senator, but also earlier coming from U.S. National Security Advisor. He was accusing China, Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe actually called the U.S. You know, representative in their country to protest, you know, saying, show us the evidence. What do you mean Zimbabwe is meddling with it? But anyway, but what is behind this? Are they trying to shift the blame? Are they trying to point fingers at someone else and saying, not us, it's someone else who is to blame for the problems that we have? Brandon.
Well, we are talking about a very complicated issue that I think we need to break into some parts and pieces here. One, we have the long-standing concern particularly since the 2016 election, about foreign actors or non-state actors that may have affiliations with foreign governments spreading disinformation online. And there is some evidence that some actors are spreading disinformation online. There is no conclusive evidence who backs them or why they're doing it, but we've had multiple different instances of disinformation campaigns making the protest, the violence, and the perception of the protest and the violence significantly worse. So that's one concern. The other concern is about state media coverage. Now, Republicans generally have made it no secret that they are concerned about state-owned media organizations from around the world covering the U.S. They believe that that is an interference with U.S. democracy. I do not believe that strongly. I believe that we should live in a world where media is allowed to
You say you don't believe that strongly,
conflicting.
so does it mean that you believe it in a certain extent? Because from what I have seen, or what we do on our show, for instance, definitely we never advocated violence. Actually, when we have a guest who is in support of the Republicans or a guest in support of the Democrats, I always try to ask them from a different perspective. You know, I try to get their point of view. But what do you mean you don't agree strongly? Do you agree to a certain extent that the state media from China are kind of promoting violence in the United States?
I think that no one is promoting violence at the moment. That question, I would say that no one is promoting violence. What I would say, if we're going to get into a much longer conversation about the various different elements of state media, not just China, but from Russia and other places, and do they have harmful or negative messages that are being pushed, I think there are examples of it. Lucien, there's a reason I do your show. I do not believe that is you, so I want to make that clear, but I also want to make that clear that because I believe that there are positive actors in state-run media, that I also believe that there are some examples of negative. But that's a different situation from here. The last piece that I want to get to is there are certain governments, for instance, the Zimbabwe example, where we are seeing domestic media in other countries justifying their own history of repressive actions by trying to create false equivalencies that show, hey, we've historically used counter, protester movements to crack down on people violently. Now the U.S. is doing it. It's just fine. See, they're just like us. That false equivalency can lead to not only damaging issues inside the United States, but particularly damaging issues to the burgeoning civil democracies around the world.
Yeah, okay, Brandon, it is a very delicate matter, and I believe in a glass house, some people say you should be careful at throwing stones at each other. However, sometimes I think people do see a high degree of hypocrisy. Look, when the situation was criticized in Hong Kong, you know, the police brutality or the kind kind of force that was used in Hong Kong, and the criticism and all of that was so strong. And then when you see what has happened in the United States, of course people are going to point out the kind of hypocrisy. Do you think there's anything wrong with that? It's not about whataboutism. It is, look, everybody has this problem probably. The United States is the one that is pointing finger the most at other people. Brandon.
I think that the statement of the most other people is one to be debated, but I would agree with you that hypocrisy should always be pointed out. And I believe that particularly the Trump administration has extended themselves to be incredibly hypocritical and self-interested in how they point out and justify the use of authoritarian type control, particularly when we have a president right now threatening to use the military against civilians. We have a situation where the United States is really on untested ground with a leader who is breaking every norm, every social custom, every legal custom that the United States has built since its founding.
Yeah, I think we really have to make the distinction: what is stoking division, what is stoking fear, and what is really just laying out calling a spade a spade. Hannah, you have lived in China for a long time. You also have a lot of Chinese friends and you have access to Chinese content. What is your observation on the kind of sentiment that is being expressed on the part of the Chinese people?
Well, I think, let me also just give my condolences to George Floyd and his family and others who are suffering at this time in the US. This is a very difficult time for everybody, and I think what COVID-19 is doing in particular is bringing out the worst and the best in society. And I think what we're seeing in China obviously is an interest in what's happening in the US, but we're also seeing interest from the rest of the world too. And it's important to be able, I understand Brandon's point about pointing out, not being hypocritical. However, at the same time, we have to also have to look at our own societies and how our societies are governed and managed, and also how, in particular, how Black people are treated throughout society. And that is the fundamental issue with the US. I hope that what Chinese citizens can start to also realize is that key point, not just about the violence and not just about how Trump is managing the society, but also about the wider calls that African Americans and Black people, Africans around the world are making for changes in society.
Yeah. From what I understand, from what I have read, I think the Chinese people have actually quite a profound understanding of the situation because they read extensively about what's happened in the United States. They're informed quite comprehensively, although maybe on the side, maybe on the fact that there are not just bad cops in the United States, but there are also good cops. But they also get reported here in China. So, John, what would you say? I just don't understand, like, when there are unrest, violence happening in Hong Kong, and everybody was talking about Hong Kong, and everybody was criticizing the Chinese government. And then when there's something happening in the United States, nobody is supposed to be talking about it. Because if you talk about it, you're gloating, you're doing a victory lap. Do you see a similar problem? Many people in China are seeing it this way.
Well, here's a double standard here. When things are happening in Hong Kong, for example, there are those senators and congressmen issuing statements in Washington, criticizing Chinese government, Hong Kong SAR government. And when things are happening in the United States, I think the Chinese government has done so far is pretty restrained. We actually didn't go out of a way to name certain senators, to name certain people, I mean, look at the legislation going on in the United States regarding Hong Kong. They even actually target politicians in Hong Kong, government officials in Hong Kong, to penalize them in certain ways, right? So this is, the total interference in another country. In China, we don't do that at all. Okay? But I think it's one thing to say, to voice our opinions, to write articles in the press, to make statements from government officials, to criticize how the thing is being handled by Trump administration. But it's quite another to essentially interfere, to pass legislations, to adopt this measure, that measure, to target certain set of people.
Yeah.
There's a clear distinction here. And if you look at what the United States has done, what China has done, they're very different.
Yeah. Well, my sentiment is also that there is such a suppressed sentiment of being wronged or being under criticism for the Chinese people, for the Chinese system for so long that when they see something horrible happening in the United States and almost exactly what they were accusing the police in Hong Kong or what they were accusing China in general, people just can't help saying, you know, look, you have the same problem and yet you have always been looking the other way. So it's time to maybe think about it, and next time when something happens in other part of the world, don't immediately start pointing finger and don't immediately start saying you are doing the wrong thing, I tell you, you have to change. Unfortunately, we don't know how lessons can be learned so easily. I have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Ryder joining us earlier from the Philippines, and of course Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer joining us from the United States.